Hello, and thank you for joining today's webinar. We will be starting in 1 minute. Hello, and thank you for joining today's webinar. We are ready to begin. Today's webinar is eligible for one contact hour. Sigma Theta Tau International Honor Society of Nursing is accredited as a provider of continuing nursing education by the American Nurses Credentialing Center's Commission on Accreditation. The speakers and planning committee members have disclosed no conflicts of interest. To receive contact hours for this CNE session, participants are required to attend the webinar and complete the evaluation form, which will be mailed to all attendees approximately 1 week after the webinar. Following the presentation, we will have time for a question and answer session. You'll see on your GoToWebinar control panel that you can send a message through the questions feature. This is where you can type in any question you'd like to pose to the presenters. Be sure to hit send so the message makes it to us. To test out this feature, please submit the state or country you are from. We would like to thank Sigma and CUSIN for today's collaboration webinar. We would also like to thank our speakers for sharing their expertise with us today. Our speakers are Dr. Hansbrough, Dr. Ostendorf, Dr. Ross, and Dr. Silver Dunker. Dr. Hansbrough came to academic nursing after years of bedside critical care experience and healthcare administrative leadership. She is dedicated to advancing the art of nursing education by designing evidence-based curriculum. She fosters the professional development of the School of Nursing faculty as they teach and mentor the next generation of nursing students. She has also been an active member of Sigma since 2007. Dr. Ostendorf is the clinical assistant professor at the University of Southern Indiana. She has 37 years of healthcare experience in critical care and has been a faculty member at the university for 18 years teaching in the undergraduate program. She has been instrumental in developing interprofessional clinical simulations to augment student learning. Dr. Ross is an assistant professor of nursing at Villanova University, where she teaches freshman and sophomore nursing students in the classroom, simulation lab, and clinical settings. She holds a certified nurse educator certificate. Her research focuses on innovative teaching strategies in nursing education, including simulation. Dr. Ross has published and presented extensively on nursing education and simulation. Dr. Silver Dunker has been a nurse for over 20 years and has worked in a variety of critical care nursing specialties in adult, surgical, medical, oncology, thoracic, neurology, and cardiac surgeries. Early in her journey, she found her love for nursing and her love for teaching as a clinical adjunct faculty, where she worked in several nursing schools teaching medical surgical clinical rotations. She is the Dean of Nursing at Fortis Institute, Nashville. Now let's go ahead and get started with today's presentation.
Hi, this is Marilyn Ostendorf, and tonight we are going to discuss the results of a study that my colleagues and I conducted regarding student clinical experiences. The study surveyed faculty on a variety of topics, but we will be discussing the survey results, emphasizing students' access to the electronic health record and the effect on patient care experiences. We will also be identifying gaps in student learning as a result of limited electronic health record access. We will also look at strategies to overcome the barriers when students have limited EHR access. Next slide. During this presentation, we will be asking you to participate in a few polls during the presentation. And the first one is, what electronic health record access do your students have at the clinical site you go to most often? Number one, do they have full access to see and do all that they need for patient care? Mark 2, if they have partial access, but are limited in what they can see or do. And then the third option is marked if they do not have access at all. So if you would go ahead and select. Okay, so it looks like here about 55% only have partial access, and that they do have some limitations as to what they can see and do in the electronic health record. 12% do not have any access at all, and then 33% have complete access. Okay, next slide. Okay, so first we're going to talk about the background and significance. Next slide, please. So recognizing the demand for informatics competency, nurse educators have been called to effectively integrate informatics into the pre-licensure curriculum. Informatics is a competency identified by CUSN. The National Council of State Boards of Nursing utilized informatics in their test blueprint to determine whether or not students have the ability to use that information technology to promote safe and effective patient care. Graduate nurses are expected to be able to utilize an EHR effectively upon graduation as they enter into the workforce. If they have not had a good experience with electronic health record prior to graduation, it does put them at a disadvantage as they begin as they enter into the workforce. So it's very imperative that nurse educators effectively integrate the use of technology and informatics into that pre-licensure curriculum some way. So whether it is in simulation, if it's a product that you use outside of the clinical setting, but it would be most helpful for students to be able to fully access the electronic health record in the clinical setting. Next slide. Okay, so looking at the problem that we identified and then the study purpose. So we know that there are restrictions on students' use of electronic health information that has been anecdotally reported, and it is very much considered a threat to the clinical experiential learning, and it is also a threat to the development of the competency, informatics competency. So our study describes the scope of nursing students' access to and the use of electronic health information systems as it was reported by nursing faculty from around the country. Next slide. Okay, and then the next slide, sorry. Okay, so the methods that we use, we included clinical faculty that taught in pre-licensure programs, like I said earlier, from around the country. We did a snowball sampling, so we were sending our surveys to nursing organization networks. We also sent it to different schools of nursing, deans and directors, and just had it sent out to everyone that we had contact with. We received 193 nursing school clinical faculty responses, and they represented 25 states throughout the U.S. The survey date was May 2018 to September 2018. Next slide. And this is a slide that represents the different regions that were represented in our study. So as you can see, we had quite a few responses from the New England area, the mountain area, the east and west, north, central area, that would be like the Midwest. And then we also had other responses from throughout the South, Middle Atlantic, South Atlantic, Pacific, and then the East, South, Central. So we felt like it was a pretty good representation of the U.S. Since we had people in all areas and regions. Next slide.
So hello, everyone. This is Wendy Hansborough speaking now. So before we launch into sharing our results with you, we'd like you to take another poll. And we'd like to ask you where your students access patient data when they're at their clinical location. So do they access it through the electronic healthcare record? Do they get a verbal report from the nursing staff? Or do they have access to notes in a paper chart? So it looks like about 61% do have access to the electronic healthcare record, 24% get verbal report, and 15% use notes in a paper chart. Next slide. Next slide. So when we asked this question, and we included some specific information, we found that students were getting a large portion of their patient information from the electronic healthcare record, just as you voted. And there was some reliance on verbal reports, and in a few instances, paper charts were used. Next slide. But students had limited report given to them, and they needed to retrieve their patient information from the electronic record. Next slide. So when we asked how students could access the electronic healthcare record, it got interesting. We found that 90.7% of faculty and 76.2% of students had access. However, 89.1% reported that their students used the faculty's access, and 20% used the RN's access to the electronic healthcare record. Next slide. So we were interested about the ease with which faculty and students gained access to the record. In other words, what is necessary at the clinical site to be given access, considering information that must be shared, such as a social security number, and how much on-site orientation time is needed in order to be given access. So on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the most difficult, we found a mean score of 4.3 for faculty and 5.04 for students, suggesting that there are obstacles to receiving access to the electronic healthcare record. Next slide. So before we move on, let's take another poll and have you tell us which of these items your students are able to document in the electronic healthcare record. Can they document vital signs and I&O, physical assessment, their patient care? Can they document nurses' notes and care plans? And can they document medication administration? So we see from your voting that 42% of your students can document I&O. Only 6% can do a physical assessment, 17% do patient care, 6% do nurses' notes and care plans, and 31% document medication administration. So let me share with you more about our data. Next slide. When we asked this question, we found that students were limited in the patient care they could document, just like you did. In a few cases, they used a paper chart, the orange bars, but you can see that even vital signs documentation does not reach 80%. As we looked at the other elements of documentation, we found less than 50% of students could document basic risk assessments or nursing notes. Physical assessment findings and patient care activities were charted in less than 60% of cases, and less than 30% of students could contribute to patient care planning. Next slide. With consideration for the earlier reported finding of students using faculty and RN access to the electronic healthcare record, we analyzed the data to find out how students were documenting. And what we found is that students use a variety of access. For instance, in the first results column, we show the percent of students who use anybody's access. Some students had their own access in the middle column, but in the last column, you can see that students documented care under the faculty or RN's access. Next slide. And when we looked at how students were accessing and documenting medication administration, we found that only 13.9% had their own access. Only 71.7% of the faculty had direct access. So students were documenting medication administration under the access of the faculty or the nurse who they were working with. Next slide. So at this time, I'll turn it over to one of my colleagues to talk about conclusions and discussion.
Thanks, Wendy. This is Jen Ross, and I'm going to get us started with conclusions and discussion. Next slide, please. So as we were preparing this, we wanted to make this a little bit more interactive and see what you all thought of these results that Wendy just presented. So she's indicated that students very often use either faculty or RN access to log into both the EHR and the MAR. So we wanted you to kind of think about what your opinion of that is, and if you would just start putting in the chat some of your first impressions of that information, and I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes and we'll discuss it a little bit further. Next slide, please.
This is Kimberly Dunker, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the so what and the conclusions and, why is this so important? We really sought to understand the lay of the land. To our knowledge, this was the first time there was a quantitative analysis done. We knew there was a lot of anecdotal information around the limitations students had when they went to clinical. We knew that because we were feeling it as clinical instructors, the deans feel it, the students feel it, and we wanted to know, is it just us or is this a national issue? And as you can see, this happens everywhere, which was an important piece of information for us to convey to people and to hospitals, that this is a real threat to our students learning and as they transition into practice, having limited access. We really wanted to focus on that aspect of the CUSIN competency, looking at the informatics. And when you look at CUSIN competencies, we know there are knowledge, skills, and attitudes that are embedded in those competencies. We have found that the ability to document is the highest level of threat to not have that skill to meet that CUSIN competency. So when students have limited access, as we've seen, they miss vital patient information. If they don't get it in verbal report and they don't have access to the electronic health record, they will be missing information. There will be gaps. And this creates missed nursing care. Could be an issue around medication administration. It really, when we look at the whole person, it does not allow the student to really see and dive into that whole patient care. There can be limited engagement. We already know students don't always feel when they come into the hospital or into the clinical setting, I should say, that they are a part of that patient care planning. If they can't document in there, if they can't even see it, how do they know what the end care is? To the student, they're coming into clinical for their time, whether it's 6 hours, 8 hours, 12 hours, and they are only focused on their time. But we want to impart on students that they are focused on the outcomes upon discharge for this patient or the next steps of where this person is going. We are focusing on missed cues. We are focusing on clinical judgment. The next generation is really going to have our students take a scenario and play it out through the NCLEX world. And if the student is missing lab data or medication administration, they will not be able to hone in on clinical judgment. We will be having to rely, we're going to talk about strategy soon, on other aspects because the students are not getting the information they need to put the whole picture for critical thinking and clinical judgment. So again, they don't build this. The number one skill that we look at in nursing informatics competency is they don't build that nursing documentation competency, which threatens patient safety. We looked at this in terms of, if you read the paper in terms of safety, this becomes an issue because a lot of times we found in our data that the students were accessing information through another nurse, whether that be the clinical instructor or the nurse that was on the floor. And maybe the nurse was signing in and leaving the patient, maybe the student, maybe the student was with the nurse or the instructor, but they were using somebody else's credentials to get information, and that is a security issue. So that becomes a real threat to safety. If the students do not have access, they will not have the ability to communicate with the healthcare team. That can also be an issue. And ultimately, there will be a gap when they transition into practice. If they are not doing this in school, then the hospitals need to realize as part of their orientation that there will be a gap. They cannot expect the students to come and have known how an electronic health record works. I mean, they know how it works, but then not having that hands-on piece. So there were quite a bit of conclusions and nursing implications to our practice that we were able to draw upon because of our study. Next slide.
So now we're going to go back to the discussion question that I posed to you all a few minutes ago. And I thank you very much for participating and giving us some feedback on these results of how much students are not using their own access, but rather using faculty or RN access. And some of the comments that we've seen coming in through the chat are, I do not agree with this approach. Students should be using their own access. EHR and medication administration needs to be done by the students. And although this workaround allows the students some type of experience, which addresses what Kim was just saying in terms of developing that competency, it role models bad behaviors for the students. So it's teaching them bad habits or bad behaviors. But some of you are saying that these findings really do match what you're seeing in clinical. So what is really happening in the clinical setting is that students do not have their own EHR access. They do not have their own EMAR access. And we as faculty are having to find workarounds to give them some type of opportunity. I'm seeing words such as concerning coming out of the chat. You know, it is concerning that students need to be using somebody else's access and that it's just not appropriate. Nursing staff are told they should never give their sign-on to anybody, but it's putting the staff and the faculty in a difficult position. And all of these comments that you all are coming up with, all of this discussion, are things that we all thought about as we looked at these results. So looking at this from an ethical perspective, if we think about nursing ethics in terms of confidentiality and privacy, when we think about this from a legal perspective, so again, that idea of you're never supposed to give your sign-on to anybody, the idea of HIPAA. So if the nurses, if the students are using the nurses' logins and they're going into different patients' charts, that looks like that nurse is going in. It looks like that nurse or that faculty member actually did the intervention. It looks like that nurse actually gave the medication when the student was the one that gave it. So there's a liability issue of who actually performed the intervention, who is responsible for following up with the intervention. So there's an ethical as well as very much a legal issue ramifications to this. And again, just teaching students those bad habits. We are role modeling when we allow students to use either our access or nurses access, we are role modeling poor behaviors and things which we tell them that they never should do. When we're teaching documentation, we say never ever give your sign on to anybody. That is your electronic signature. Yet then we are turning around and giving them our sign-ons. So it really is a conundrum in terms of giving students the practice and the experience that they need while still maintaining ethical and legal rigor when we're in clinical with students. And I'm going to pass it back to Kim, and she's going to address this a little bit more in terms of, so what can we do? How can we fix this problem? Next slide, please.
So our next poll that we want to know as we are starting to think about strategies in response to this data is, do you use an electronic health record at your school, at your nursing school? Yes or no? Do you use your own? Do you purchase your own? That could be DocuSign, different products like that. Oh, so it's about a 50-50 split. So some of your nursing schools have purchased electronic health records, and this can be used throughout your program and your curriculum at different aspects having to do with lab or clinical. Next slide, please. And we bring this up because when we thought about strategies, we thought, oh my goodness, we really need to, if this competency is not being met through the skill of documentation, we need to do something about it. We need to recommend something that the students are this is definitely a barrier to attaining this competency, and we need to think about what are different things. So one of them is an academic health record that you can purchase through different resources. There is usually a cost for the student or the program. And, you know, then there's a whole, it's like a book, it's a resource. So you have to think about a curriculum component and how it's going to be utilized. If you're going to have the students purchase something, I always say we have to see, you know, how much we're integrating this product. There is faculty technology support, right? And then you want it to be functional, right? So we want it to mimic what the students would actually see. So there's some really amazing products. I'm not pushing any products, but there are things that we can do. If this is something that you are seeing as a major barrier, that this is one strategy. The other strategy we thought about is really trying to have a voice with the IT department and then the other nursing education departments to make the case to, number one, the study. One of the things I did when I was doing this study is I did talk to one of the hospital's nurse informatics officers. And I said, you know, we're doing this study because we really want to establish some information on what is the impact to the students. And I think we're all in it for ourselves. You know, the academic people are in it for their students, and the practice people are in it for the patients. And we have to kind of see where that bridge comes together, because we don't want a lot of gaps in, you know, either side, because we're helping to put nurses out, you know, for them. So, you know, having good relationship with the IT department. A lot of times I know sometimes hospitals are just managing their own staff and trying to get their own staff, you know, access to add students can be a whole nother layer. So is there opportunities there for us to make that transition better? And then you can use downtime forms to practice documentation. Most hospitals have forms that are used when these systems go down. So that's another strategy that we suggested that can be used, you know, if the students have limited access to at least documents. Sometimes what we found in our study is the students may have access to view, but not necessarily document. Next slide. So that concludes some of the things that we found in our study. We have our reference list here. We have this study has been submitted for publication, has been accepted, and Dr. Hansbrough, do you want to talk about that?
Sure, be happy to. This study has been accepted for publication in Nurse Educator. On the Nurse Educator website, it is there as a pre-publication or preprint version of the study, so you're welcome to read it and perhaps share some of the information with your colleagues at your School of Nursing to determine if there's some action that maybe you need to take to, number one, improve your students' informatics competency, which is so important, and also perhaps partner with the IT departments in your clinical facilities to see if they might change the access that your students and your faculty have to the electronic healthcare record. And I think at this time we're happy to answer any questions people might have.
Earlier in the presentation, you had mentioned simulation. Do you think simulation will fill the gap?
That's an excellent question. I think it depends on your state regulations and how, first of all, the adoption of simulation, how it's being used for clinical, if it's being allowed. So there's a lot of questions around that. And it depends on what program. I know for my nursing school, we have a program where the students can go in and document during simulation, and they have an electronic health record. But every program's a little different. But I do think that simulation will definitely be an important piece if the students are not getting access in clinical to their electronic health record.
So we are in the midst of across the curriculum integration of an academic electronic healthcare record. So we are taking it really a semester by semester because of the need to bring faculty on board. It's not something you can just plop into the middle of your curriculum and hope it works. So it has to be a very intentional rollout because it's complicated. But as we go along, students are now going to be using it for both their clinical experiences. So they will go to clinical, and then when they come home, instead of writing sort of the old-fashioned care plan, it's 20 pages long, they will instead be documenting in the electronic healthcare record and doing their care planning there. And they have access to it because it's their own license for this. So when they are in our simulation suite and they have simulation experiences, they are also using that same academic electronic healthcare record to document the care that they are providing in simulation. So we are really integrating it across our curriculum and throughout our clinical experiences and our simulation lab.
We would want our students to have access to documentation as well as to document. How is the best way we go about implementing this? What did you guys find was the best way?
So that's a very interesting question. And in the work that we did for this in the literature review, what we found is that this isn't just for nursing students. This problem exists for medical students as well as other healthcare professional students. And I really believe in what I found in the literature was discussions about that information technology services in our healthcare organizations are really not always aware of the role that nursing students play, and that someone may be making a decision on the access they're given without really understanding the role that faculty and nurses play in the delivery of healthcare. So that would be one place to start, to open a dialogue with your clinical partners to find out how you can expand that. Because really this is a worrisome problem that our students are documenting care under someone else's login. So it appears that that other person is actually doing the care, delivering the medications. So this is a problem that really does need to get fixed.
We often hear that charting isn't allowed due to the Joint Commission. Is there any suggestions on how to engage a conversation regarding this barrier?
I'll let one of my colleagues take that one.
I think that when we think about, we are essentially, a lot of us are vying for clinical spots and we are at their mercy and we are guests. And I think that the best thing is to be at the table and have that discussion with, the units of the number one, the importance, and then maybe even if it's really that big a deal, a lot of time it's a strain on the IT department. So if you have students that are going into clinical for 2 days, is that really a battle versus the students that are going to go into clinical for a longer time? We also may need to think about how we place students, and instead of putting them here one day and here one term and there all over the place, maybe we keep them in at least one hospital, so that they are learning one medical record and then their access can be used. I think we just need to be a lot more creative, and we both need to kind of come to the table. I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts on that.
I don't know why this would be a Joint Commission issue.
I
Because
don't believe it is
I don't
because
think it is.
we have full access for the electronic health record and we're accredited by the Joint Commission. So that may just, and it may be some a way that they have interpreted the Joint Commission standards. So, it's certainly a conversation to be involved in. But, when you're looking at preparing these pre-licensure students, it is imperative that they are able to document in the electronic health record what they've done. It's imperative that they are able to access what other disciplines are doing for the patient and what is going on. The risk for missed care and the wrong care is way too high without students being able to access this information. And I think that probably sometimes, and it's like Kim said, it's cumbersome. It's cumbersome to get a sign on for all of these different places that the students go. So maybe looking into, having them in one or two different places and where they learn that particular electronic health record. And I think that sometimes, the electronic health record is new to a lot of places. Some places have had it for a long time, and it's an everyday way of life. But for those that have just recently adopted it, I think that they, struggle with so much getting all of the employees on board and teaching them everything and having everything just right, that they forget that these students can pick this stuff up in a matter of seconds. If we were going to have champions of electronic health record, it would be the students, because they are the most familiar with all technology. So, so I don't know. I think that sometimes people stray away from having students electronically chart because they have to teach them.
What are your thoughts about students documenting immediately after the care versus documenting later? Does it depend on the situation, the clinical EHR versus the academic EHR, or in simulation?
Well, I think ideally all care should be documented in real time. That's certainly the trend that we're trying to invoke with all healthcare employees, that it's at that point of care. So I guess regardless whether it's in the clinical setting or in simulation or with the academic health record, it should be as timely as possible.
An important part of discussion is faculty review of student documentation. Should faculty be strictly looking over the student documentation, or like the bedside nurse?
Oh, I think faculty need to be a part of that. I mean, I wouldn't want the students to put something I've had students put things in the electronic record that just, I look and I say, what? The lung sounds were what? You didn't come and tell me, you know, and it needs further assessment or so. I definitely any thing that the student is putting in the electronic record, I check off. I also, when I do orientation with the students, I talk about what are the things that you need to come and tell me right away. What are the abnormals that I need to know before you even start documenting if you do have access. I just think it holds us accountable. I don't know if my colleagues have any other thoughts on that. I know Jen might, because she's in Maryland, you're in clinical.
Yeah, I think it's really important that the faculty are seeing what the students are doing exactly for what you just mentioned, Kim. The problem is the amount of work that it puts on the faculty. So when the faculty need to be in with students administering medications or performing a head-to-toe assessment or doing some type of procedure or whatever the case may be, especially when students are charting in the EHRs, it can be extremely time-consuming and extremely onerous to go through all of their charting. So I think the faculty need to do it, but I also think that needs to be considered in terms of workload and what else they're able to do in the course of a 6 or 8 hour clinical day.
Where I'm from, the nurses are so good about going through the charting with the students, and then they will actually, sign off on their charting as well. So faculty look over it, the nurses look over it, and because sometimes it's even good points of reference just to clarify some of the terminology of some of our assessments, and having a talk with the nurse, when it says this, what does this really mean? And I will tell you, I can't say enough good things about the nurses that my students work with. They're very good about helping the students with electronic documentation.
We have found that students have a hard time dissecting a chart. What do you think is the best approach to helping students navigate the EHR?
I think that hits on this whole discussion, that they need to learn to be familiar with it, and the only way they will learn that is by using it. And so it's like any of the other skills that we teach in nursing, any of the other competencies that we teach students to develop. They need to start using the electronic healthcare record, and as they continue to use it, they become more proficient at it. But they're not going to be able to navigate it very well to start with, but we need to allow them to be able to do that. And I think I want to add too that the way that we learn to chart well is by charting, that we see what nurses have charted, we see what other professions have charted, and then we do it, and then we get the faculty or the nurses, as Marilyn was saying, the nurses then can review it, and it's a teaching moment for students. But it takes time for them to develop the art, really, of documentation over the course of their nursing school career.
And I think giving students an orientation to the EHR and really prioritizing that as much as we prioritize anything else we prepare them for when they first enter clinical. So that orientation day that the students, they get to see the unit, and they, a lot of times we'll have them go on scavenger hunts. Where are different things found? What are the codes? The EHR needs to be a part of that. And they really need to have an opportunity to see where everything is and how to click through it. The academic health records are one good way to help them familiarize themselves with EHRs. The problem is every EHR is different. So if they've used an academic health record and then they go to hospital X, that EHR is going to look completely different. They go to hospital Y the next semester, that EHR is going to look completely different. So they do, I think, need the time in clinical to really have the opportunity to go through and look around. One strategy that I use for my students is I have them arrive at clinical early. So they have at least a half hour in the morning before report, before they're responsible for the patient, to just click around in the EHR and find things. And they get faster as the semester goes on because they have that opportunity to be familiarizing themselves with it.
Keep those questions coming. One limitation I've had with students is not to allow them to chart until I have okayed their documentation. When students are under their own access code, then I cannot amend it. I can only sign them off. I think it can be problematic if they include inaccurate info based on their inexperience. We all know even if deleted, it remains in the chart. I do not want inaccurate info in the chart. Any thoughts on how to better this process?
I mean, if you have a rule that they need to come to talk to you before and go through the charting before you put it in, and they don't listen to you, to me that's like going to give a med without you or doing something else without you. So, I mean, unless you sign them off and you say it's just like a head to toe, I have to watch my students do their head to toe before I can sign them off and say, yes, you can go do this without me standing there. So I think your expectations are right on, and I would not question that. I think that that's a great strategy, and even if they have the capability of putting it in, they shouldn't until they've been checked off. That's my opinion, and as a dean, that's what I would say to my faculty.
Rather than having the student sign on as someone else, would you have them write down their head to toe assessment on a piece of paper and then bring it to you first, or go ahead and have them chart under someone else?
I would not have them. I don't like having them chart on someone else at all.
No.
Yeah, I actually do have my students chart on paper for me. So where I do clinical, only about a year ago did the students actually get EHR access. Prior to that, they did not have it. And I would have the students chart on copies of the downtime forms so that I could see that they understood how to chart, that they knew what to chart, the terminology to use. I would review it and then it would get shredded. It never became part of the permanent health record. And one of the things I noticed in the chat earlier, one of the participants here today mentioned having students write narrative notes and putting them on the learning management system like Blackboard or something like that, which is another great strategy and another way to let them practice the art of documentation, even if they're not doing the computer-based version of it.
I think the other thing, just to tag along to what Jen said, is a lot of times these electronic health records are drop-down menus. And it's a world of difference in terms of critical thinking and putting your thoughts together when you're writing a narrative or a SOAP note or some of those other strategies. So it's just another way of getting to the same information. I almost think getting information from the electronic record is equally or is more important than actually documenting it, because a lot of the documentation now is just click boxes and chart by exception. So I do think that they need their training wheels, a lot of times. I don't know if that makes sense.
Without access to simulation, are there other innovative ways that you guys can think of for students to practice their charting?
So I think a couple of them we just mentioned. So having students chart in other ways, whether it's on paper downtime forms, writing narrative notes and uploading them to the LMS, but doing more quote unquote paper charting, even if it never becomes part of the chart. So just, I guess, to give a concrete example, we do a summative freshman simulation for our students, and it is graded, and they interact with a patient, and then they have to write a narrative note at the end of what happened and the learning needs that were identified and the teaching strategies that they used to teach the patient. So in that, they're having to put everything together and write it down in a narrative note, but it's just a Word document. But it's giving them that practice and seeing how they put a note together, what kind of terminology do they need to use, and things like that. I don't know if anyone else has any other ideas.
An audience member did say that they've had access to like a playground in Epic, so that could be a potential possibility. How about peer review of charting prior to instructor checking? What are your thoughts on that?
Is anybody doing that?
That was just a question that we had from the audience. I'm sorry.
Right. So I don't know if any of the other, if my colleagues, if anybody's using a peer review of their charting.
We don't.
I've never used it, but actually, when I heard that, light bulbs went off in my head. That's a really neat idea that I had honestly never thought about. And it would give students more of an opportunity to practice, so to speak, because not only are they doing their own, but they're looking at somebody else's and critiquing it and giving feedback. And that's the type of thing that actually I've used in the classroom, but never in the clinical setting. And I think that could be translated to the clinical setting. It might be hard in an EHR because, again, once I know one of the concerns that was raised by an audience member was once it's in there and submitted, it is part of the record. Even if you delete it, it's still there. But if there was a way to do that with like a practice documentation or something written on paper, I think that would be a really neat strategy.
I also think you could incorporate that as, a lot of times we have the leadership model where you have one of the students that is like kind of the charge nurse, and you could have them go and critique all of them and then, work with, go back. So I think that you could definitely use that strategy. What a great idea.
Yeah, I was even thinking like send 2 students in to assess one patient and then have them sit down together.
Yeah.
And what would they chart?
I do that in orientation. I always pair them up with the electronic health record, because if I have 6 or 8 students on the floor, that's 4 people I have to go around and help orient them to the electronic health record. And then they help each other.
Now, we do have orientation sessions that are provided by the facilities for all of the students who come from everywhere, from all schools, all programs. They do orientations to the electronic health record with all of them. So that is something that the facilities here have provided. We're very grateful and fortunate for that. That's also something probably that people factor into whether or not they're going to give access to students. It is that cost of orientation. Who's going to be teaching them? Do they have to provide that kind of stuff? So.
Well, thank you so much to our presenter today for all this great information. Sigma is grateful that you took the time to share with this audience and look forward to hearing more from you in the future. As a reminder to our attendees, please submit the state or country you are from in the questions feature. We hope you enjoyed this webinar. Be sure to check out Sigma's upcoming webinars, podcasts, and resources to support you and your colleagues at sigmanursing.org. Also, previously recorded webinars and podcasts are freely available on the Sigma repository. Thank you for joining us and have a wonderful night.